Hi, I'm Linda Bergquist. I'm a church planting catalyst in the San Francisco Bay Area, working among all different cultures, all kinds of people. And we're talking about the topic of contextualization today. Contextualization simply means to put in a context. In Christian contextualization, it means to take the work that we do, the words that we say, and put them in the context of a people that God's calling us to reach. I did a session on that. It's just a general session, and it was aimed at church planners. This time, what I'd like to do is aim the work of the contextualization at the people who work with church planners, people who assess them, the people that challenge them, the people who provide for their needs, and ask us to be contextualizers and not just the planter to be the contextualizer. So I'd like to actually start with several things that are really important about assessments. So assessments means really just helping a church planter determine whether they're a fit in church planting and whether they're a fit for the particular community or style that they're going to plant a church in. Some of the things that I've discovered about contextualization across cultures is one is that body language really matters. So there's some cultures that they would prefer not to look at you. They'd prefer not to look into your face. They'd prefer not to look into your eyes, and they turn away. And a lot of Western cultures think that that's aversion, and we don't think highly of a person who does that. Another thing that I find in assessment is that there are some cultures in which it's okay to take credit for what you've done. And sometimes you take credit for what your team has done, and you use the first person a lot. Another kind of person that you assess is going to be from a culture where you don't use the word I. You listen for the word we. And sometimes I have to turn around and say to the person, well, what do you mean? What was your part in helping to make this thing happen? Because they're not as likely to talk about themselves. Another aspect of assessment is that sometimes we assess for families and marriage. I have right now a Pakistani couple that I'm working with, and I've got a Nepali couple, and both of them come from arranged marriages. And arranged marriage, a healthy arranged marriage, looks differently than a healthy marriage in our Christian context in the United States. So I have to look at that and say, what is healthy here? And how supportive are the two people, the husband and the wife, going to be of one another in their context? That's just another thing that I have to look for. How is leadership defined in that culture? So you can start a church out of a gang culture. And sometimes I'll look for a person who comes from a gang background, and oftentimes they're very authoritative. And it's fine to follow in line with that person. Hierarchical understanding of pastoral roles is fine in that culture. It's not so fine in other cultures where a team approach is very much needed. I've got a struggle right now with a church in another culture where the church planter has one idea of leadership and the core group has another idea of leadership. And they both come from the same culture, but he's a generation older than the core group is. And they're going to have to work that out. So that's an issue for them. So not only do you read the planter, but the planter actually reads you as well. So the planter, for instance, hierarchical leadership, as I mentioned before, works in some cultures. It doesn't work in others. A millennial culture is less inclined to accept you as a leader because you're a hierarchical leader. They are more inclined if you relationally invest in them. And if you invest in your relationship with God, so relationally and spiritually they see you as a leader, then they'll follow you, then they'll hear you out, pay attention to their advice that you have to give to them. But if you place yourself in a hierarchical position, they're already reading you in the context of that assessment, and they already know whether they want to work with you or not. There are some distinct cultures that I work with. For instance, if I work in an Asian culture, there might be a very high emphasis on saving face. In a culture like that, where there's kind of that shame base, I'm not going to correct a church planter in a group setting. Even if it's a group setting where we're supposed to actually be able to give one another feedback, in that culture, if I've got to set that up in a different way, because in that culture, being called out in front of a group is just such a very difficult thing. You don't want to do it. I'm working with an African pastor right now from Nigeria, and the Nigerian pastor is creating a website, and he wants to start a multi-ethnic church. Well, in his multi-ethnic church, every person in the photos on the website are African. And while that doesn't look very multi-ethnic to me, looking in, for him it's multi-ethnic because they come from various African nations, and it's very multicultural to him. It's not when I look in, and I have to talk with him about how that actually appears on his website. Another aspect of being contextual when you're working with planters is the idea of fundraising. So in some cultures, you're really not allowed to do the asks. So we think that a church planter shows leadership by being able to ask for funding and be able to receive funding. But there are some cultures in which that's really abolished. You can't go into some cultures and say to the people that you work with and the people that are around you, can you fund my thing? They just aren't going to buy into it. Another aspect of fundraising is when a church planter makes a budget out. A lot of the African American church planters that I work with have to make a budget that includes musicians, not just a worship leader, but musicians that are there. The musicians get paid and sometimes even get paid before the pastor gets paid. Or they'll take that out of their own salary and pay the musician. So kind of different fundraising mechanisms that are in place. And we need to listen to that culture so we know what's realistic in that culture. What is fundraising really going to look like in that culture? Launching a church. Well, some churches do a shallow launch where they just bring a lot of people in. It doesn't matter. You just bring a lot of people in. The idea is to get as many people there as possible and to work with them through faith issues. They become Christians. There are other cultures, for instance, all of the Korean cultures that I work with, that actually don't want to do it that way. They want to get a few very strong, multiplying leaders, deeply obedient disciples of faith. And from that, that's how they want to grow. It's a different approach. How do you celebrate? How do you let a church planter know that you believe in what they're doing? How do you let a church planter know what is a normative way to think about goal setting? How do you help a church planter know what appropriate milestones are in their culture? We can listen to them. So we tend to use certain models and find a certain kind of church planter and break them into our models and teach them how to do things our way. And what I'm advocating for you who work with church planters and you're helping them is to work out of who they are, how God created them, how God placed them in a culture and wants them to reach a culture that may be very different than yours. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it.